Have you ever heard of an economic miracle? A country growing so fast, so consistently, it seems to defy the laws of economics? Now imagine that miracle turning into a meltdown in just a few months. That's not a movie plot. That's the very real story of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, a collapse that started in Thailand and sent shockwaves around the planet. So, let's get into it.
All right, here's how we're going to break down this incredible story. First, we'll look at the incredible boom times, the East Asian miracle. Then, we'll see how it all started to unravel. Next up, we'll dive into the controversial rescue plan from the IMF, the bitter medicine. After that, and this is crucial, we'll talk about the devastating human cost. And finally, we'll look at the aftershocks and how this crisis literally reshaped the world economy.
So let's set the scene, right? For most of the late 20th century, East Asia was the absolute envy of the world. We're talking about countries like South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia. They were dubbed the Asian Tigers. And they weren't just growing, they were exploding. Their success seemed like an unstoppable force of nature.
So naturally, the big question on every economist's mind was, what's the secret sauce? How do they pull this off? Was it some kind of genius government plan, or was it something simpler? And the debate really boiled down to two very different ideas.
Okay, so here are the two competing theories. On one hand, you have the developmental state argument. This idea says that governments were kind of like expert gardeners, actively steering the economy. They picked winning industries, protected them, and nurtured them until they could compete on the world stage. But on the other side, you had the capital accumulation theory. This view is a lot less romantic. It basically says, look, there was no magic trick. It was just a mind-boggling amount of investment in two things: stuff and people. More factories, more roads, more machines, and a huge push for better education.
But here's the thing. Whichever theory you believe, you just couldn't argue with the numbers. I mean, look at this. Average annual growth of 8 to 12%. To put that into perspective, a really healthy, mature economy like the US gets excited about 2 or 3% growth. So yeah, this was a completely different stratosphere of economic expansion.
But, and there's always a but, isn't there? Underneath all this spectacular growth, a huge vulnerability was building. This whole miracle was being financed by a risky addiction, billions and billions of dollars in cheap foreign loans. It created this massive credit bubble that was, well, just waiting to pop.
And then, on July 2nd, 1997, it popped. The whole thing started in Thailand. See, they had their currency, the baht, pegged to the US dollar at a fixed rate. But global investors smelled blood in the water and started betting billions that the baht would fall. Thailand's central bank burned through all its US dollar reserves trying to defend the peg until they just couldn't anymore. They were forced to let the baht float, and it sank like a rock. That was the first domino. The panic spread like a contagion. Within weeks, it hit Indonesia. By October, the Hong Kong stock market was in a freefall. And by November, even a powerhouse like South Korea was on its knees, forced to go ask for a bailout. The speed of it all was just terrifying.
And when I say collapse, I mean it. The numbers are just brutal. Let's just run through a few of them, rapid fire. Take Indonesia. In a single year, its currency, the rupiah, lost over 83% of its value against the dollar. Just gone. The financial fire just kept spreading. In Malaysia, the ringgit was hammered, losing almost half its value. Imagine waking up and finding that your life savings are suddenly worth 50% less. That's what an entire country went through.
And in Thailand, where it all started, the baht plunged more than 40%. It was an absolute bloodbath across the entire region, wiping out a decade of progress in the blink of an eye.
So this table really gets to the heart of why this was so devastating. Look at how closely the currency collapse matches the drop in national wealth. Here's why that was the killer. Companies had borrowed all that cheap money in stable US dollars, but their revenue was in their local currency, which was now becoming worthless. Let me put it this way. Imagine your mortgage is in dollars, but you get paid in a currency that's now worth a fifth of what it was. Your mortgage payment just multiplied by 5 overnight, but your salary is the same. What happens? Mass bankruptcy. Now imagine that on a national scale.
With their economies in a nosedive, these countries had to call the world's financial 911, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF showed up with the promise of billions in bailout loans, but that money came with a price, some very, very strict conditions.
The IMF's plan was basically economic surgery without anesthetic. It was a 4-step shock therapy. First, you jack up interest rates, aggressively. The goal was to stop money from fleeing the country. Second, you slash government spending. We call that austerity. Third, no more bailouts for failing companies. Let the zombie banks and corporations die. And finally, you open everything up, increase transparency, and make it easier for foreign companies to come in and buy up assets.
So why would they prescribe such painful medicine? Well, this quote from the IMF's second-in-command at the time really explains their logic. It was a kind of tough love. Their view was, look, yes, super high interest rates are going to cause a lot of pain. But a total currency collapse? That's a fatal wound. So you have to stop the bleeding at any cost. It was about choosing the lesser of two evils.
But many people were not buying it. Critics, including some Nobel Prize-winning economists, fired back, saying the IMF was completely wrong. They argued that forcing budget cuts and high interest rates on an economy that's already in a deep recession is like telling a sick person to go run a marathon. But the sharpest criticism was that the IMF was trying to solve a problem it had helped create by pushing these countries to open up their financial markets way too fast in the first place.
You know, it's easy to get lost in all the talk of exchange rates and fiscal policy, but we have to remember that behind all these numbers, a real human catastrophe was unfolding. This wasn't just about spreadsheets, this was about millions of lives being completely upended.
And as the World Bank report from the time pointed out, that suffering wasn't shared equally. When a crisis like this hits, it's a grim, predictable pattern. Women and girls pay the highest price. They're the first to lose their jobs and the first to be pulled out of school. Decades of social progress could be wiped out in a year.
I mean, just look at this chart for Indonesia. It is a gut punch. Before the crisis, the poverty rate was around 7%. After the crisis, it was projected to nearly triple to 20%. Think about that. Millions of people who had just struggled their way into the middle class were thrown right back into poverty. This wasn't a gradual decline. It was like falling off a cliff.
And that kind of economic pain tears a society apart. You had massive layoffs in all the boom industries. There were heartbreaking reports of child labor and prostitution skyrocketing as families grew desperate. All that stress frayed communities, leading to more violence. And in Indonesia, the economic anger finally boiled over into political revolution. Widespread riots ended up toppling President Suharto after 30 decades in power.
And then there's this number, a number that just stops you in your tracks, 10,400. That is the estimated number of suicides in just Hong Kong, Japan, and South Korea that were linked directly to the crisis. It's a tragic, sobering reminder that when an economy breaks, it breaks more than just banks. It breaks human beings.
Eventually, the acute crisis passed. The economies began the long, painful road to recovery. But the world that emerged from the rubble was fundamentally different. The crisis left deep scars, and its aftershocks completely reshaped the global economy.
So what changed for good? Well, first, the affected countries essentially vowed never again. They adopted what you might call a fortress strategy, stockpiling huge war chests of foreign currency reserves so they'd never be so vulnerable again. Second, there was a painful but necessary push to clean house, forcing reforms in corporations and banking. Third, the crisis accelerated a massive power shift in Asia, as China, which avoided the worst of it, saw its influence grow. And finally, the whole episode fueled a huge anti-globalization movement around the world, creating a deep and lasting distrust of institutions like the IMF.
And all of that leaves us with a really big, lingering question. The Asian miracle showed the incredible power of global capitalism to lift millions of people out of poverty. But the meltdown showed how terrifyingly risky and fragile it can be. So the challenge that remains, for all of us, is to figure out how to build economies that are both competitive on the world stage, but also resilient and caring enough to protect their own people when the next storm inevitably hits.